Welcome back to the cryptowrld channel, everyone. My name is Josh, and in this video, I'll be talking about a long-term Bitcoin price prediction for the current Bitcoin bull market, looking at the correlation between Bitcoin and the stock market, also looking at Bitcoin valued in terms of the stock market, looking at potential bull market top predictions, and when we can know the bull market is potentially starting to top out, possible warning signals to watch out for, and when the next major altcoin season could be happening. So I'll be talking about all of that and more later in the video, so definitely watch to the end. First of all, starting off on the monthly Bitcoin price chart. Each one of these candles is one entire month worth of Bitcoin price action. So this is looking at pretty much Bitcoin's entire price history going all the way back towards around 2011. And obviously, if you've been in Bitcoin for even more than just a few weeks, you'll know about the Bitcoin halvings. If you've done at least a little bit of research into Bitcoin, usually the Bitcoin halvings happen roughly once every 4 years. And traditionally, throughout pretty much Bitcoin's entire price history, we have these 4-year Bitcoin halving cycles, as we can see here. And so usually leading up to the Bitcoin halvings, we see these recoveries in the price of Bitcoin out of the previous bear markets. And then around the Bitcoin halvings are usually around the beginning to mid of the bull market. So the bull market by the halving has essentially already started, but we still have a long way to go in the bull market once the halving actually happens. And then usually in between the Bitcoin halvings, roughly around the middle period between the Bitcoin halvings, we see a Bitcoin bear market that usually lasts for roughly around 1 year worth of a downturn here. And so simply based on the 4-year Bitcoin halving cycle, which throughout Bitcoin's history has worked very well, as we can see, if we're simply just looking at this cycle alone, we're most likely going to continue more of a bull market until perhaps later this year, and then sometime maybe later this year, and especially in 2026, it's likely we'll see some form of a bear market. And then the next Bitcoin halving will be in early 2028, so then most likely during 2027, we'll see that recovery stage out of the bear market moving towards the halving, and then the next bull market around 2028 to 2029. And so once again, that's just based on the halving cycles alone. So once again, based on the Bitcoin halvings, this bull market is almost complete. We still potentially have more room towards the upside, but we're closer towards the top than we are towards the bottom. But with that being said, if we're taking a look at the Bitcoin correlation to the stock market, so this right here is that chart that I was just looking at, the Bitcoin price chart on the monthly time frame, and this chart right here is the Nasdaq 100 index on the exact same time frame, the monthly time frame. And what we can see between the Bitcoin price and the Nasdaq 100 index is that especially more recently, we have a very high correlation between the Bitcoin price and the Nasdaq 100 index. And in fact, over time, over the last decade, this correlation has been increasing. So for the last few years, we've seen a very high correlation between Bitcoin and the stock market. And then in the earlier years of Bitcoin, we saw some periods where we had negative correlation, which means Bitcoin is basically doing the opposite to what the stock market is doing, and some periods of no correlation, which means basically they're just doing two different things, or sometimes the same thing, really no correlation. But this indicator right here is the correlation coefficient. So when it's all the way up at this high level, closer towards 1, a 1 correlation is a perfect correlation, which means they're basically doing the exact same thing. And a -1 is a negative correlation. So they're doing exactly the opposite. And in my opinion, based on what this chart is showing us, the Bitcoin halvings are having less of an effect on the price of Bitcoin compared to the earlier years. And that does make sense if you consider what the Bitcoin halvings are fundamentally speaking. Because of course, the first Bitcoin halving took the Bitcoin block reward from 50 Bitcoin per block down to 25 Bitcoin per block. So obviously that was a drop of 25 Bitcoin per block mined, whereas the second halving was half of that. It was from 25 down to 12.5. The third halving, half of that again. The fourth halving, half of that again. And so as of right now, after this fourth halving, the Bitcoin block reward is currently 3.125 Bitcoin mined per block. So roughly every 10 minutes. And as time goes on, as we see more and more Bitcoin halvings over the coming years, over the coming decades, ultimately we'll just see less and less Bitcoin being mined per block, but it'll be less of an impact on the price of Bitcoin because we'll only be talking about very, very small changes in the amount of Bitcoin being mined, whereas most of the Bitcoin by this stage has already been mined. And so for example, in say 100 years from now at the final Bitcoin halvings, the final 1 Bitcoin will likely take around a decade, give or take, to actually mine the final Bitcoin based on after all of the halvings that we see, we'll only be seeing a very, very small amount of Bitcoin actually being mined per block. And so in other words, as time goes on, each Bitcoin halving actually loses relevance. The very, very important halvings were the first few halvings. They had the biggest impact on the change of the supply and the inflation rate of Bitcoin. And especially considering the growth aspect of the market cap and the liquidity of Bitcoin. Currently, of course, Bitcoin is $1 trillion asset with a lot of liquidity, which has obviously grown a lot compared to a decade ago. And so now that we're entering into the multi-trillion dollar valuation for Bitcoin, alongside the stock market, obviously already valued well into the multi-trillions of dollars, usually markets of this size tend to have a high correlation because they're heavily driven by liquidity. And the perfect examples of this was the previous bull markets here in 2021 and then subsequently the bear market in 2022. Of course, we had a lot of money printing happening during 2020 leading into 2021, and that flooded the markets with liquidity, flooded the markets with money, which pumped prices of assets and of course caused inflation. When you flood markets with money, you increase prices of basically everything. And so that's what we saw in 2021. But then as the Federal Reserve saw that very high inflation rate, tried to bring down inflation, of course they had to raise interest rates, perform quantitative tightening, basically the opposite of money printing, which helped to cause the 2022 bear market. And so while that was happening in the stock market in 2022, of course we saw the same thing in Bitcoin. And then as stocks ultimately recovered into 2023 and 2024 and to the current day, of course we've seen something similar in Bitcoin and crypto. And so we now have to keep in mind that the Bitcoin halving cycles are having less of an effect on the price of Bitcoin, and we now need to start shifting our focus towards what the stock market is doing in these much larger markets and what global liquidity is looking like, because this is starting to drive the price of Bitcoin on the larger timeframes more than the halvings, at least in my opinion. And so we now have to consider the possibility that Bitcoin bull markets and bear markets might not necessarily last the same amount of time as what we've historically seen. So for example, bear markets might not necessarily be exactly 1 year long like what we've seen in the past. We may end up seeing either a 6-month bear market or even a 1.5 year bear market, for example, if the stock market were to play out something similar. Or of course, if the stock market continues in this bull market, if the stock market continues breaking into all-time highs, we should not necessarily expect any major bear market, even if the Bitcoin halving cycle tells us we're meant to see a bear market very soon. If the stock market keeps pumping, don't necessarily expect a major bear market for Bitcoin, because once again, the stock market and global liquidity is heavily driving the price of Bitcoin, especially more recently over the last few years. And if we're taking a look at this Bitcoin price chart, this is actually Bitcoin not valued in US dollars, but Bitcoin valued against the NASDAQ 100 index. So essentially, the NASDAQ 100 index currently is at roughly around 22,000 points. So essentially, this chart is at a current price or ratio of 5, which means roughly 5 shares of the NASDAQ 100 index. The NDX essentially buys 1 Bitcoin. And so when this chart is bullish, Bitcoin is outperforming the NASDAQ 100 index, outperforming the stock market. When this chart is bearish, Bitcoin is underperforming the stock market. So stocks are actually holding up better than Bitcoin. And what this chart very clearly shows us is that Bitcoin is essentially a high beta play, a high beta asset from the stock market. So essentially, it's just a higher volatility stock market. So of course, when stocks are bullish, Bitcoin's also bullish. When stocks are bearish, Bitcoin's also bearish. But Bitcoin basically moves in larger moves, more volatile moves in both direction. And so during the bullish times, we see much larger gains in the price of Bitcoin. But then during the bear markets, of course, Bitcoin crashes harder than most stock markets. But what we are seeing right now is an all-time high breakout for Bitcoin against the NASDAQ 100 index, which basically means Bitcoin obviously has already been outperforming the stock market over the last couple of years or so, essentially since the beginning of 2023. And simply based on this being an ascending triangle pattern breaking out towards the upside, technically speaking, this could likely continue over the coming months or possibly years for the price of Bitcoin, pointing towards a continued period of outperformance. And this will very likely happen if the stock market remains at least somewhat bullish. We don't necessarily have to see massive gains in the stock market, but if the stock market just doesn't see a massive crash, if it just remains somewhat bullish, it's very likely that Bitcoin would be very bullish in the coming months or years. But of course, the things that would potentially change that to the bearish direction would be if we see significant changes in economic policy and things like that, or black swan events, like for example, if some sort of conflict breaks out, or if we see a rapid rise in inflation and subsequent rise in interest rates, like what we saw in 2022, of course, that can also affect the markets. But while stocks are bullish like this, of course, continue to expect a bull market or a larger bullish trend to continue for Bitcoin. And just before taking a look at some other important Bitcoin price charts, looking at possible bull market top and bottom signals, first, if you want to trade any of these moves in the price of Bitcoin or any other crypto, personally, I'm taking a lot of my crypto trades over on BTNX, so I'll make sure to leave a link to BTNX below this video in the description and in the pinned comment. And if you use that link, it'll take you to this page where you can claim some massive trading bonuses, like for example, up to $45,000 you can actually claim using the link below this video just by trading crypto. But if you're not one of these larger traders here, you can also get deposit bonuses. Like for example, if you deposit $1,000, you get a $200 bonus into your BTNX account, but only if you use that link. And in case you're wondering, BTNX is a no KYC exchange, which means you can access it from basically any country in the world without needing any KYC. But for whatever reason, if you don't want BTNX as an exchange, there's also 2bit as another option out there, another exchange that I also trade on. So I'll also make sure to leave a link to 2bit below this video. And if you use that link, it'll take you to this page where you can also claim some massive trading bonuses, like for example, up to $50,000 in trading rewards, and also a $30 sign up bonus and a 20% deposit rebate up to a max of 200 USDT. So for example, if you deposit $1,000 over here, you also get a $200 bonus, but only if you use that link. And so if you're going to be trading crypto anyway, you might as well get set up ready to go on these exchanges using the links below this video to claim these massive bonuses here that you can only claim using those links. And in case you're wondering, 2bit is also a no KYC exchange. But with that being said, taking a look at this Bitcoin chart on the monthly time frame as well. And this Bitcoin chart is basically a price model pointing towards a bull market top price target, which I actually shared here on the channel over a year ago. And in fact, I was one of the only ones on all of YouTube when the price of Bitcoin was at $60,000, calling for around 110 to 120,000. Obviously, many others were either saying Bitcoin's not going to go above 100,000, or they were saying Bitcoin's going to go to 200,000 or 300,000. And so once again, I've been talking about this exact prediction for over a year now on the channel, since Bitcoin was at much lower prices. And essentially, this is looking at retracement or extension levels for the price of Bitcoin on the monthly time frame based on the monthly candle closes. And so this first extension I basically drew from the monthly candle close high to the monthly candle close low during around 2011, and looking at the 350% extension level to the nearest percent, that's pretty much exactly where we topped out, to the nearest 10% give or take. And then using a ratio of 75% of 350 to the nearest 10%, that gives us 260%. So if we're basically taking a look at the same retracement from the swing high to the swing low on the monthly candle closes, looking at 260% as the extension level, that sits at around 19,000, pretty much exactly where we topped out in the 2017 bull market. And so if we're simply using the same diminishing returns ratio of 75% of the previous extension level of 260% to the nearest percent, rounding to the nearest 10%, that actually gives us 200%. So if we're looking at the 200% retracement level from this previous retracement from swing high to swing low on the monthly candle closes, that 200% extension gives us around close to 60,000, just under 60,000. And obviously we hit just above that before the bull market started to top out during 2021. And so if we're looking at the exact same retracement from swing high to swing low on the monthly candle closes, but this time the extension is once again using the same diminishing returns ratio of 75% of the previous extension, that gives us approximately 150% of an extension level this time around, which sits at around 120,000, just under 120,000. So essentially in between 110K to 120K, in that range. And obviously just recently we've hit exactly into that price range, in between 110K to 120K, in that exact price range. We've just made it into there recently, which is obviously what I've been predicting for over a year now on the channel, since much lower prices. And so essentially this Bitcoin price chart is telling us that the bull market has either already topped out or very close to topping out. But remember, this prediction is highly based on the halving cycle prediction, of which of course, as I explained in the beginning of the video, the halving cycles are starting to lose relevance. So they might to some degree have a bit of an impact on the price of Bitcoin, but not as much of an impact as what we saw in the earlier days of Bitcoin. And so yes, even though this prediction has exactly played out as I predicted over a year ago now on the channel, we could potentially go above 120K if the stock market continues in a bull market. And so definitely keep an eye on what the US stock market is doing, because if this remains bullish, don't necessarily expect a significant bear market for Bitcoin while the stock market is in a bull market. And if we're taking a look at this Bitcoin price chart, this is on the weekly time frame. This is the Pi cycle top indicator, basically looking at two moving averages. And usually when these moving averages, when these lines cross over, we tend to see a top for the price of Bitcoin, at least historically speaking. And so usually when the orange line crosses underneath the pink line, that's usually the top signal based on these two moving averages. So once again, this is the Pi cycle top indicator, and it flashed right here around April 2013, right at this top in the price of Bitcoin. It flashed right here as well. We saw a crossover on these two lines around November 2013, right at this exact top. It crossed over right here around December 2017, right at this exact top. It crossed over right here around April 2021, which was the first major top in the 2021 bull market. But so far, we have not seen any cross between these two lines in this entire bull market, which is telling us that we're not really that close to seeing a bull market top, at least based on this indicator right here. Now, we did get somewhat close during around March 2024. So for example, if we did not see that larger cool off during 2024, and instead we just kept pumping, we could have possibly topped out much sooner. And so this is why it's important to see these cool offs and larger corrections here and there during a bull market to create more of a sustainable bullish trend. And so once again, this top signal for now is nowhere near close to actually flashing. And if we're looking at this Bitcoin price chart on the monthly time frame, looking at the monthly Bitcoin RSI, and currently as of recording this video, the monthly Bitcoin RSI is sitting right on the borderline of overbought. So we're not really that overbought, but usually when the RSI is overbought, we continue in the bullish direction, because this is on the monthly time frame. So basically this chart takes a long time to actually turn around into the other direction. And so for example, if the bullish momentum is very strong, we can continue much further towards the upside into overbought on the monthly RSI. And usually that is what has happened in previous bull markets. We had very overbought in the monthly RSI, usually above 80 to 90 in the RSI, whereas currently the RSI is sitting at close to 70. And now historically speaking, the tops in the monthly Bitcoin RSI around the bull market tops have actually decreased. So keep that in mind. We might not necessarily reach the same levels as we have in the past in the monthly RSI. So for example, rather than 90, we may end up seeing only 85 or 80 in the RSI. But once again, currently the RSI is only sitting at barely 70 on the monthly time frame. And these most recent peaks in the monthly RSI were sitting at roughly around 77 and also at around 76. So not really that close to what we've seen around previous bull market tops. And we can also use the monthly Bitcoin RSI as a great buy signal. As always, not financial advice, but if the RSI on the monthly time frame for Bitcoin drops below 50, historically speaking, those have been the best buying opportunities to accumulate Bitcoin to hold for the longer term. And obviously that's what I said here on the channel at the bottom of the 2022 bear market, sharing that amazing buying opportunity back then. And when we eventually see another signal like that again at some point in the future, whether it's a few months or multiple years from now, ultimately I will be sharing that here on the channel. So definitely stay subscribed to this channel to take advantage of these buying opportunities and possible sell opportunities as well. And if we're taking a look at the weekly Bitcoin price chart, it is worth pointing out that we still have this major bearish divergence forming and already starting to confirm on the weekly time frame. So keep this in mind. And I have been talking about this in my regular daily update videos, which is a sign that this bullish trend, this bull market, is potentially starting to slow down and losing momentum. And so especially if we see more confirmation here by seeing a further rejection in the weekly Bitcoin RSI, further confirming the bearish divergence on the weekly time frame, in that situation, it's possible that in the next few weeks or months, so kind of the midterm for Bitcoin, not necessarily long term, we could see a slowdown for Bitcoin. So potentially a correction like what we saw during around February to March, or potentially just a larger sideways consolidation, kind of like what we saw around Q3 2024. Those are possibilities here if we see a little bit more confirmation in the coming weeks or months. But once again, don't necessarily expect a massive bear market like 2022 if the stock market is remaining in a bull market. Once again, we only saw that severe 2022 bear market because the stock market also saw a severe bear market during 2022. And even back during the 2018 Bitcoin bear market, the stock market was looking quite shaky back then during 2018. But of course, more recently, we've seen a much higher correlation between stocks and crypto. And with that being said, taking a look at the Bitcoin dominance chart on the monthly time frame, each one of these candles is one entire month. And we could see that during the Bitcoin dominance bull markets here, during these bullish moves, that's essentially a Bitcoin season where Bitcoin is outperforming most of the altcoin markets. So altcoins are really not doing all that well on average during these periods in the market. And then vice versa, when we see major crashes or dumps in the Bitcoin dominance, those are periods where the altcoins are having massive gains and outperforming Bitcoin during these periods in the market, also known as an altcoin season. And typically what we've seen in the past around Bitcoin halvings is that following the Bitcoin halving, roughly around 6 to 12 months after the Bitcoin halving, we usually see a massive altcoin season based on the Bitcoin halving cycles. But obviously this time around, we're not necessarily seeing very similar price action in the Bitcoin dominance compared to what we saw these last two times. And so once again, this is all telling us that the Bitcoin halving cycles are losing relevance. They don't have as much of an impact for Bitcoin and crypto compared to what they have had in the past. And so ultimately we have to rely on other signals and indicators, as I've been saying throughout the video, looking at all of these different charts pointing towards what could be likely about to happen. And so looking at the Bitcoin dominance chart on the monthly time frame using this perspective, it's clear that we're still in the bullish trend. We've not yet confirmed any change in this bullish trend, any change in price structure. But the next logical price target based on price levels, resistance levels, would be sitting at approximately 71%. Previously, we've seen multiple significant rejections in the Bitcoin dominance at really just above 70%, around 71 to 72% in the Bitcoin dominance. And currently, as of recording this video, is sitting at just under 65%. And so it's possible we could see a little bit more of a run towards the upside in the coming months or the coming weeks, for example, in the Bitcoin dominance, which means altcoins still lagging behind what Bitcoin is doing in general. And obviously, there's always going to be some outliers. So keep in mind, I'm not talking about every single altcoin in the market. There's tens of thousands of altcoins out there. So of course, some here and there will be outperforming Bitcoin even during a rise in the Bitcoin dominance. But in general, most of the altcoin market is underperforming Bitcoin during these periods in the market. So this could likely continue over the coming weeks or possibly months here. Once again, each one of these candles is one entire month. But based on the current rate of this climb in the Bitcoin dominance, based on the current trajectory, potentially in, let's just say, half a year from now, we could reach close towards 70%, give or take, where we would start running into very significant resistance. And so that could be a very likely turning point for the Bitcoin dominance. As always, there's no such thing as a 100% guarantee, but that will likely once again act as very strong resistance, which means there's a high probability that we would struggle around that area on the price chart and possibly see a rejection. And if that were to happen, then of course that would be an altcoin season if we see a strong rejection like that. And so once again, just based on the current rate and based on that level of resistance, potentially in, let's just say, around half a year, maybe later in the year or near the end of the year, maybe even early 2026, we could end up seeing some sort of major altcoin season if this continues like this and then starts running into this significant resistance. But of course, I'll be keeping you up to date here on the channel every single day. So make sure you subscribe to this channel with notifications turned on so that you don't miss out on any of these important update videos. And once again, if you want to trade any of these moves in the price of Bitcoin or any other crypto, get set up ready to go using the links below this video to those exchanges if you want to claim those massive bonuses that are only available using those links. And if you want to actually know how you can trade crypto to easily profit in the market, then make sure to watch these videos popping up right here on your screen. The video in the top left shows you how you can profit from bullish or bearish price action using long positions or short positions, and the video in the bottom left shows you how you can easily profit from choppy sideways price action. But anyway, that is everything that I have to say for today. I really hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next video.